Seems like there is much more to say about what self-love is not than about what it is. There are so few Bible texts or stories that address self-love. In our Western culture, we are messed up around the concepts of self-love and self-care and self-compassion. We tend toward one extreme or the other with all three. What I initially thought would be an easy sermon to preach has turned out to be somewhat complicated. I appreciate Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis titling the first chapter in her book on fierce love, "Love Yourself Unconditionally, It All Starts Here." Despite how complicated the topic of self-love can be, what is not complicated is this premise, that self-love leads to love of others. How we are able to be fierce lovers in this world is dependent upon how we are able to love ourselves. As with so many things in our spiritual lives and as with so many spiritual practices, saying it doesn't mean it's easy to do. In fact, the opposite is true. Loving ourselves might be one of the most difficult spiritual practices to engage in regularly. The reasons are myriad, and yet there seem to be some common elements. We'll begin with one. Nero Savanathan begins his TED Talk on persuasion with this scene. Imagine you're on a shopping trip. You've been looking for a luxury line dinnerware set to add to your kitchen collection. As it turns out, your local department store has announced a sale on the very set you've been looking for, so you rush to the store to find a 24-piece set on sale. 8 dinner plates, all in good condition. 8 soup and salad bowls, all in good condition. And 8 dessert plates, all in good condition. Now consider for a moment how much you would be willing to pay for this dinnerware set. Now imagine an alternate scenario. Not having seen this 24-piece luxury set, you rush to the store to find a 40-piece dinnerware set on sale. 8 dinner plates, all in good condition. 8 soup and salad bowls, all in good condition. 8 dessert plates, all in good condition. 8 cups, 2 of them are broken. 8 saucers, 7 of them are broken. Now consider for a moment how much you would be willing to pay for this 40-piece dinnerware set. In an experiment by Christopher C. from the University of Chicago, the result was that people were willing to pay more for the 24-piece set than they were for the 40-piece set by double. And this was despite the fact that in the 40-piece set, they got everything they would get in the 24-piece set, plus 6 cups and 1 saucer. This literally makes no sense, so what is happening? In a sense, the broken items in the larger set negatively impact the overall perceived value of the entire set. Nero Savanathan takes this learning to talk about persuasion. I want to take this learning to talk about why self-love is difficult. As people who mostly claim to be Christian, we have been deeply impacted by the Bible. In particular, we have been impacted by the creation myth that included 2 earth creatures, one called Adam and the other called Adamah, or in our language, Eve. The story that is told of disobeying God has been used to claim that ever since the first moment we are born, we are all born into sin and we are stained by that sin. All was perfection right up until the eating of the apple, and perfection was ruined. Right from the very beginning of our faith formation, we were told, in essence, that 2 of our cups are broken and 7 of our saucers. We are not perfect, but imperfect right from the get-go. Immediately, we lower our own value, like those in the experiment lowered the value of the exact same dishes because some were imperfect. Add to that stories in the Bible that seem to suggest that the more we suffer, the more we are like Jesus. Although oddly, these stories seem to mostly be used against people of color and women and queer people and any who are otherwise oppressed or abused. There are stories about how we should serve everyone else first. Stories like ours today about how our mindset should be that everyone else is more important than we are, and even that we are supposed to think everyone else is better, and that's what humility is. We have a long way to go. While those of us who grew up on Christianity can appreciate certain things about it, we also have so much undoing and unlearning to do in order to have true humility, the definition of which is to have an accurate sense of ourselves. That's what humility is. In the letter from Paul to the church in Philippi that Rob read, Paul is writing while in jail, and he's writing this community that has been newly formed. He's addressing some minor conflict that has arisen, and he's trying to get the community to address that conflict. There are some important facts to know about Paul as we try to understand this text. First, Paul is in jail. He's not sure if he will ever return to Philippi, so he wants the community to be able to resolve their own conflicts. Second, despite how it sounds in so many of his letters, Paul does not believe suffering is inherently good. He simply understands that believers might suffer because of the way the world is they are living in. Third, Paul attaches great importance to the unity that the community lives. He is a main proponent of the common good, though he doesn't phrase it that way. Instead, he uses the word unity. An individual should be willing to set aside their own interests in order to achieve what is good for all. In the case in our text, he's encouraging the community members who are disagreeing to come together and be of the same mind about whatever is causing the conflict. He tells them to draw on the encouragement, on the love, on the compassion they have experienced, and then apply those to this in order to achieve similar mindsets. Instead of each person or side only thinking of themselves, they're instructed not to do anything for selfish reasons, but to think of others in their community as more important, as better than. So the whole is better than the one. In verse 4, Paul says, instead of each person watching out for their own good, watch out for what is better for others. Remember, it's related to a specific conflict or argument. Paul goes on to say how they should adopt the same mindset that Jesus had, which was a willingness to obey God no matter the cost. If we read this and think that we are to ignore or even despise ourselves in order to serve others, we've completely missed the boat. One of the ways for a community to experience unity is for every person in the community to seek the common good, the good of the community, rather than simply what is good for one's own life. When we talk about the need to unlearn and unpack and heal from messages so many of us were given in Christian communities, we have to acknowledge that for people who are Indigenous, Black, or people of color, the messages given to them were all about the denial of personhood and worth and value, including how this text has been used because Jesus identified as a slave. You can imagine how that was used against people who were supposed to become slaves. Never used for the people in power to become that, simply used by the people in power. One of the people I follow on Instagram who is Indigenous posted this recently. When I take care of my body, I think about how I wasn't taught to care for my body. And when I think about that, I get so angry at white evangelical churches I was raised in to have me believe that self-love and care don't matter. To know my Indigenous Quay body isn't loved and respected by this culture or the churches I grew up in just amplifies the anger, hurt, and pushes me toward resistance in the form of caring for myself even more as I fight off the stereotypes and traumas that brought me here. I was grateful for her reminder that white conservative Christianity has always been against bodies, and even more so in the case of Indigenous, Black, and people of color bodies. What does self-love and care look like when you have been taught that you don't even have a self, or that you are 5/16 of a person, or that someone is allowed to own you because you are not fully human? Most of us have spiritual work to do or to continue to reclaim our bodies and declare them good. In today's Western culture, most of us have been programmed to think of self-love and self-care as the same thing, and that it consists of purchasing something or indulging in something that will result in our pampering or our cheering up. We're supposed to go to a spa or get a massage or have our nails done or go out to eat or go to a show for entertainment or buy new clothes or maybe a new hat or buy cocktails we can't afford or buy a really nice bottle of wine or travel or buy a car that makes us feel hot, or allow ourselves an extra glass or two of wine, or eat the thing that feels extra special, despite what it does to our health, or binge watch TV because we deserve a rest. You get the idea. We have been taught by so many messages and so many ad campaigns that the best way to love ourselves is to indulge ourselves. If you've ever purchased one of those things or indulged in one of those things, you know that it can actually work for a minute. You feel better for a minute. A massage feels like taking care of yourself because you're getting the stress out of your body. The same with going to a spa. Getting your nails done or going to a show makes you feel like you're investing in yourself in a way that brings you joy. And it works for a time until it wears off again. Self-love, though, is not the same as self-care. And indulgence often masquerades as self-care. Self-love is the act of accepting ourselves as we are and not demanding more of ourselves than we would demand of others. Self-love for people of faith includes understanding and believing that we are a part of God's good creation and that God's image is in us and all of creation. Self-love is not just a warm, fuzzy feeling, but results in actions. If we believe we are God's beloved, part of God's good creation, we will act in the following ways. We will forgive ourselves and make amends when possible. We will make mistakes and then work on ourselves so we aren't making those mistakes into habits that are harmful, but instead we learn from our mistakes. We see ourselves as part of a whole. We work for our own and others' mutual thriving. And this one might be the most difficult. We will have the same compassion for ourselves that we have for others. Self-love is action as much as feeling and belief. Self-care is different from self-love, though ideally they're intimately connected. Self-care can be thought of as a direct result or consequence of self-love, though I think it's possible for people to engage in practices of self-care even though they've not been able to cultivate self-love. Here are some definitions of self-care so we can understand some differences between self-care and self-indulgence. Self-care is a practice of doing things for ourselves that help us stay healthy and allow us to thrive. Self-care builds our resilience and our capacity to fight the highs and lows of life. Actually, I don't like the word fight there. It's really to ride the highs and lows of life. Self-care does not change our circumstances, but can influence our responses, our flexibility to adapt, and our access to resources of all kinds. Self-care is not about cheering ourselves up. Self-care is about nurturing our resources and our inner strength so we can do the things we want and need to do. Some of the key words in those definitions are a practice, stay healthy, to thrive, influence, nurturing, and doing the things we want and need to do. Hearing those definitions, doesn't it become obvious that our consumer culture way of approaching self-care misses the point? Self-care isn't about immediate gratification like indulgence is. And I'm not saying there isn't a place for indulgence. We all do it, and in and of itself, it's not a bad thing. Self-indulgence can be good sometimes. I am saying that it is dangerous to confuse indulgence and self-care. People who hate themselves can indulge. Just because you indulge doesn't mean you love yourself, and it can mean the opposite. Self-care is reaching out to someone when you are struggling in order to receive care. Instead of buying something or eating or drinking or smoking something you think will cheer you up for a minute. How we engage in practices of self-love and care have become even more confused during this time of pandemic. What about individuals who want to love themselves and take care of themselves by not getting a vaccine? What about organizations or businesses who are saying, you as an individual cannot make a decision on your own behalf, but you must do the right thing for everyone, which is to get vaccinated? What is self-love and self-care in the middle of all of that? Even in our own church community, we struggle with what it means to care for ourselves and what it means to care for the community. If you come to church in person, it's good for the community. Does it mean it's also good for you? If you worship online, you are caring for yourself. How are you also caring for the community? There are no predetermined, prescribed answers. These are unprecedented times, and we're trying to find ways of living that allow for each of us and our whole community to thrive and be well. Some of the barriers to self-care are when we're missing information, when we don't know how to care for ourselves, or to do something that would lead to that, when we don't think we need self-care, when we think we're not deserving of self-care, or when we are unsupported by culture, environment, and or the institutions, which is true for people of color all the time. Often, self-compassion is needed before we get serious about engaging in self-care. Self-compassion is defined as treating yourself the way you would treat a dear friend. Loving ourselves unconditionally is one of the more difficult practices in our lives. There's a reason Jackie Lewis devotes an entire chapter in her book to it, and the first chapter no less, because self-love is the foundation for all the love we give into the world. In her book, she courageously tells stories about the places where she has deep wounds and how she has worked to heal those wounds over time. She tells the story of her father and how he was wounded in his childhood and the anger that resulted in him from those wounds. She talks about how his anger then led to her wounding as a young person. She repeats what we already know, that hurt people hurt people. Her conclusion is that if we are to love ourselves, we have to go to those hurt places in us. We have to be aware of them in order to begin the healing process. That is one of the tasks of self-love. And loving ourselves in that way helps us love others who have also been wounded. Misinterpretation of the Bible and the use of Christianity to support supremacies have led to warped understandings of self-love. Self-love is grounded in God's vision of the beloved community, that God's whole creation is meant to thrive together, that if we would treat others the way we want to be treated, and that we would treat ourselves the way we would treat our dear friends, thriving will happen. If we buy into the harmful myth that we are less than worthy of love because we are less than perfect and therefore not worth love, we cannot love ourselves and others. If instead we believe that perfection was never the intent or hope or goal, we accept ourselves in our imperfection, and the work of thriving based on self-love can begin. So may we all love ourselves into being fierce lovers in our world. Amen.